I thought it was very interesting that almost everybody mentioned that the sensitivity of interviewing children was something that they really were hoping to learn more about here. So I think it's very fortuitous that we have this panel already on the agenda. What I was going to say is, journalists are always looking for the most compelling, intimate, and truthful way to explain what's happening in our world, and that often means including voices that the wider world would not otherwise hear. And given that children are so often the victims and survivors of trauma and violence, obviously we want to include their voices in our work, not for the sensational value of that perspective, but because they rarely get a mouthpiece in policy or social debates. And of course, as we've talked about, this past month in particular has been especially harrowing for children in this country with the border separation policy, among other things. But there are good reasons that journalists often leave children's actual voices out of stories. You simply can't approach a child for an interview the way you would approach an adult. There are matters of maturity, of consent, of brain development, and as folks have pointed out, of the danger of re-traumatizing. And few of us even really understand, I think, what even just a conversation about a shooting that they witnessed, or maybe the sight of one's father beating one's mother, what that does to a child's mental health. And then with the internet, there's also the internet is not new anymore, but it brings up a lot of issues that were not issues before, such as if you interview a child today who's 10 years old, whose parents give you permission to talk to them, in 15 years, that child is going to be 25 looking for a job, and all of their history is on the internet for anyone to search for. That's an actual example that I came across that I hadn't thought about before I did that story and before the parents kind of came to me and brought that up. But the answer is not simply to exclude children from our stories, nor is it to always have other people, older people, talking for them, which is why we have these two panelists here who will help us understand how to weave the voices and the perspectives of the most vulnerable people in society, truthfully, but without causing them harm. So, John Woodrow Cox is, as Bruce was saying, has won, he's a Washington Post reporter who's won a number of prestigious national awards, most notably for his series on how children experience gun violence. That was a Pulitzer finalist, as well as winning this year's START Award. That series truly gets into the heads of the youngest, most vulnerable survivors of violence in a way I think a lot of reporters might not be brave enough to get into. So I'm hoping to hear about how John managed to do such a sensitive job, and take it from here.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Karen, for that. So this series had been in a part of a conversation with my editor and I for a couple of years. Maybe 3 years ago, I did a story about a little girl who was born with HIV, and followed her for 4 or 5 months through the process of being told that she had HIV. She was 10, and in that story, we kept her totally anonymous, but the reporting of that story kind of gave us the idea of, what are other ways that we can tell kids' stories through their own eyes. And we had wanted to tell these stories for a while and had gotten delayed, and then finally at the beginning of last year, I launched off on it. And the idea was to take a very familiar topic, which in the U.S., gun violence and gun control is a constant topic, but to tell it in a new way and to tell it through the eyes of children. And we ranged in age. These stories, there were 6 in total, and ranged in age from 16 and 17-year-olds. These girls were at the mass shooting in Las Vegas. There was 6 of them who went to this small, affluent Christian high school in Las Vegas, and I got there 2 days after the shooting, and this was their homecoming week, and I was with them that whole week. And this was the youngest in the series, a little boy he was 4 years old, and he was shot in the head in a road rage incident. So I just want to take you through some of what I learned, and maybe just give some tips in hope that it might inspire some of you to do some of this reporting as well. So my first tip always when I talk about this work is to be human first. And, that's really something that I learned before I was telling these stories. I was a cops and courts reporter in the state of Florida, which for those of you who don't know, Florida, it's a state that produces a lot of crime and a lot of crazy things. And so I did a lot of sensitive stories there, and, always found that, nothing was more important than being sensitive to what people had gone through. And that is especially true when you're dealing with kids. And what that means is to tell them you're sorry for what they're going through. That's what I start with. And even the 4-year-old, I told him that I was sorry for what he was going through. And that matters. And I think people can tell if we're being sincere or if we're there to take advantage of them. So be human first and a journalist second. I think you want to be really clear with the parents and the kids of who you are and what you're there to do. If you have other stories that you can share with them, you just want to be totally transparent. So even kids that are 5 and 6 and 7 years old, I sit down and I explain with them who I am and who I work for and what I do, that I tell stories about people who go through things, and I'm here to tell their story about what they went through. Even showing them photos of other stories, maybe other kids that I've talked to. So, there's sort of a theme, I think, through what I have to say is that we shouldn't underestimate kids ever, that they are much more observant than we think they are. And they have a lot more on their mind than we think they do. And so, I talk to them as much as I can like I do an adult. And I think that has worked for me. Do as much pre-reporting as you can. I think that is critically important when you're writing about kids. And what that means is talking to their parents first, talking to their teachers, talking to if they have doctors or counselors that you can have access to, talking to their siblings. And what that does is it gives you a sense before you walk in of what they've been going through. A question that I always ask is, what questions has the kid been asking? I always want to know that. So that gives you such great insight into what's on their mind, their anxiety, what they're dealing with. Kids often, if you say a question that I find to not be very useful is, how are you feeling, or how did you feel about this? But if you can find out the questions they're asking, it'll tell you. That was very much true of Tyshawn, who was a little boy. He was the first in the series. He lives in Southeast DC and in a difficult neighborhood, and his father was killed in the middle of the day outside of his school when he was in the cafeteria of the school. And, Tyshawn was a kid that I never really interviewed. We would have conversations, but it wasn't like a sit down and I'm going to interrogate you. It was just spending time with him. And that gets to the idea of this pre-reporting, is that if you have the chance to do it, you don't always, but to just spend time in a child's space, you'll learn a lot more from them than if you, hey, let's sit down together and I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions. So this entire story was, one of the first things I asked his mother was, what has he been asking you? And he was asking a lot of questions about the man who killed his father, if he was going to get out, if he was going to come and get him. And, that was much more profound for me. And I wouldn't have gotten that, I think, if I just sat down and asked him questions, because he was very guarded. He is. He just believes in, culturally a little bit, part of his neighborhood is you have to be tough and you can't show your feelings. And so every story I work on about kids, always ask that question. Always ask, what are they asking you? What are they asking their teachers? If you have the chance, like I said, to just spend time with people, that can be a lot more useful. So Tyshawn, I met him at his father's vigil about a week after his father was killed, and just spent time with him. I was at his home quite a bit, and this is to sort of illustrate the danger of his neighborhood. This was not for him. It was not an isolated event. He had been on a playground when a shooting started. This is a bullet hole in his front door. He was surrounded by these sorts of things, and just spending time in his world showed me so much. So here's an example of something I got, not through an interview, but just spending time. This was a note that he wrote to his father while his dad was in the hospital. It says, "Dad, I hope you're okay. Wish that I could see you, but I couldn't, and I hope you are all right Do you feel all right? And give up anything on my body for you. So, this is a way, we often think of the only way to get insight into someone's mind or a kid's mind is to have them tell it to us directly. This told me more about what was going on in his life, in his mind, than anything he could have said to me. He was writing a letter to his dad, hoping that his father made it. But that just takes this. I didn't get this on the first day. I got this 4 or 5 days in the reporting when his grandmother said, "Oh, he wrote this note to his dad." And what that means is there is nothing more valuable than spending time. And that's not true just for writing about kids. All the best stories I've ever written resulted from spending a lot of time with people. Went to his school to get a sense of the world that he lived in. And this was, for me, really profound. The question was, what makes you sad in your neighborhood? These were kids all in his school who were just asked to draw that. And there weren't words, but if you can see these scenes up close, there's people being shot, there's funeral scenes, and the oldest these kids were 8. They were between 3 and 8 years old drawing these images. And so again, it was that reporting around the child that can be really powerful. This is inside the school. And, I saw a lot from Tyshawn in his school. There was a moment when I was sitting behind him in class and he drew this image. And this was right after he had gone to the funeral. He'd buried his dad on a Friday and he'd gone back to school on that Monday. And he drew it, and then he scratched it out. And I asked him later, I said, what did you draw? And he said, that was my dad. And I said, well, why did you scratch it out? He said, because it looked ugly. So again, that wasn't an interview. That was me observing a moment that was really powerful and said a lot about where his head was. In advance of the funeral, I was with him that morning and watched him play this really, violent video game in which he was killing people and being killed. And this is just moments before he goes to the funeral of his father, who was shot to death. Sat next to him at the funeral and, heard him talk to his brother and watched him take a handkerchief up and put it in the casket because he didn't want his father to forget him. And those are all things that were just resulted not from an interview, but just from spending time. Now, there are times, of course, when you do have to sit down and do an interview with a kid. And what I started with Tyshawn with, I did start with what we would call an interview, but really it was just trying to make him comfortable with me. I wrote a story out of South Carolina about a school shooting there. There were a group of first graders on a playground who had just gone out for recess when a 14-year-old showed up and jumped out of his truck and opened fire on this school. And he killed a first grader, and he also wounded this boy, whose name is Colin. So this gets to what do we do when we are going to interview people. So I always want to go to the place that they are most comfortable. So that's I ask them, where do you want to talk to me? And that's almost always their room, because they almost always want to show you stuff. They want to show you their toys, because that's really much more important to the kid, in my experience, than talking to me. Is they want to show me their cool stuff. And I let them do that for however long they want to, because so much of the challenge is just to get them talking to you, just to get comfortable, get them used to you. You're a new, strange adult, and some kids love the attention and some kids don't. So that's where I always start. If you have the chance, if you have the time, we don't always, sometimes we're on deadline in a day or two, you have the chance to sit with them when they're doing an activity. I've really found that with the hardest kids to get to open up. I sat with a little girl earlier this week who is deeply traumatized and has been through an act of gun violence, and she talked to me more when she was working on a puzzle than she ever had before. It just was something that she was doing, something she enjoyed, and we just talked. And I just I sat with her for 2 hours while she did that, and I think that's a really useful thing if you have that opportunity. I like to always be at their eye level or lower. So I will actually sit on the floor usually when I'm doing these interviews, because I think if you're over anyone, it's just more intimidating, especially for a kid. You don't want to feel like a teacher to them. You don't want to feel like an authority figure, and you want them to be in charge. You want them to be guiding the conversation. And so as long as my knees can handle it, I'll just continue to sit on the floor when I talk to kids. I always have the parents in the room and am really clear with them about what I'm going to talk about and give them permission to interrupt. I ask them to be watching their kid because they know their child much better than I do. If their kid is maybe having a moment that I don't pick up on, I ask them to intervene, to interrupt me. Too, they're sort of the second reporter often too, is that if a kid maybe has forgotten something, they can prompt them. So, it's very much a team effort. And I think that's part of the ethics of this too, is that you want to be totally transparent with that parent, and two, that you'll just get a lot more from the child if they can sense that the parent trusts you. So there was a moment with Colin that I was in his room. He to the point the last speaker made, that kids react differently. Every kid reacts differently to the same event, the same traumatic event. That is so true, and I've never seen that more clearly than in Townville, South Carolina. He was shot, Colin was shot, but he was okay. On the surface, he was okay. Now, whether he's going to deal with things in the future, I don't know. But he was very matter-of-fact in describing the shooting, what it felt like to get shot, seeing his friend Jacob die in front of him. And at one point he said, do you want to know what the gun looked like? Do you want to see what the gun looked like? And he went into his toy chest and showed it to me. And, it was sort of, for me, an example of a moment you can have with a child that you really can't have with an adult. He didn't understand. Was 7 at the time. He didn't understand sort of the context of that. He just was like trying to be helpful. If you're a reporter, if you're a journalist in that room and a kid says, do you want to see what the gun looked like that shot me? That's incredible. That's a really incredible thing. It speaks to, I think, how much more profound reporting on children can be often than it is with adults. So I always start with really easy questions, just to have a conversation. What's your favorite hobby? What's your favorite toy? Things like that, just to get them talking. And then the questions that I ask about the traumatic event are often, just tell me what happened that day. What was the first thing you remember from that day? What did you have for breakfast that day? Just to start the timeline, because often that's what you want to get to, is what was the traumatic event. And, starting just at the beginning of the day, and then your job really is just to guide them, just to hold their hand. And, because kids will go astray, like adults will go astray in interviews, and just to bring them back and guide them back. But something I sort of skipped earlier, but, one thing about that conversation with the parents beforehand is understand if those kids have triggers. If there's things you shouldn't talk about, things you shouldn't ask, to basically get permission for, where you can go with a kid. I'm going to be quick since I'm going a little bit over here, but I would say a couple of other things is that, kids sometimes will give you long pauses. There'll be long silences, and be comfortable with that. Learn to be comfortable with really long pauses. Give them moments if they need to take breaks. Just, again, let them be the one who's guiding the conversation. Something that I heard last time I was in this room that I thought was a great tip, it was from Lizzie Presser. It's something that I've done I think just sort of instinctively for a long time, but it's something that I think you should really be mindful of, is at the end of these conversations, bring the child back to a happy place, to something good and positive, so that you're not leaving them in that darkness. Because often these conversations will go somewhere really dark, and you want to bring them back up out of that. And again, I just want to reiterate, last point, is don't underestimate kids. I think people have asked me so much about, well, how did you do this? How did you do this? And sometimes I think it wasn't as hard as people think it was, is that kids are incredible, and they want to be heard desperately, and they want attention more than anything else in the world. So, we have an opportunity, I think, to tell really important stories through their eyes, and you can do it on almost any beat, because they have opinions about everything. Thank you.
That was incredibly helpful. You should put it on some kind of, no, not PowerPoint, but a cheat sheet for all of us doing interviews with kids. Okay, so quickly, we know Lynne Jones from yesterday. She's a child psychiatrist, a relief worker who's worked closely with children in distress and survivors of trauma. So she has a very intimate perspective on both what they experience and I imagine how to talk to them about what they've experienced. And unlike most of us, she's been specifically trained in interviewing trauma survivors, not necessarily for journalistic ends, but this is where we learn from other disciplines. So thank you, Lynne.
Perhaps this is a moment to confess to the Dart Centre that there are 2 pages in the book where I object to the use of the word trauma. That would be a whole lecture. I'm not going to tell you why, but you can read the book. And it's my little plea to all journalists to abolish the word here and now. Have a look. Bruce is smiling. Have you read those pages? No. Anyway, we don't use them. We don't use them in professional guidelines. We don't use the word trauma. We explain why. Moving on. So underlying... I've put some... Oh, I've got one slide here and one slide there. I'm going to be slightly speedy because I've cut my talk because I had less time than I thought. What's so interesting is how much I overlap with John as a journalist, and I think the reason I chose psychiatry is because I'm born nosy, and as a doctor you have the enormous privilege of more or less being allowed to ask anybody anything, and I'm actually going to tell you a bit about not asking and why I don't. But so many of my basic principles are similar to John's that I thought I should put them up. The assessment, whatever you do, whatever conversation you have with anybody, you hope it's going to do good, not harm, whether you're a journalist or a doctor. So that's the start. And working with children and their families, completely agree with John. Be well informed. I was so glad to hear you say that. Get the story, get the facts, get all the information you possibly can from someone else. You don't need to ask the child. You should know everything about what happened from somebody else before you talk to a child. And then my cardinal rule, which of course is different from yours because it's a clinical rule, I'll come to my other role of interviewing in a moment, is do not force a child to talk. Do not force talking. There is nothing therapeutic about forced talking. Psychological debriefing is out. It does harm. Grief work is out. It does harm. I can give you WHO guidelines. Do not force people to talk about traumatic experiences if they don't want to. And that includes you being a journalist. So I'm quite sure that John was talking to children who wanted to talk to him, and I'll come to that. But he wouldn't ask a child who didn't want to talk. Don't do it. Because then you will re-traumatize them. If a child doesn't want to talk, they may never want to talk. Bad luck. Get your story from someone else. But they may want to talk, and you may be, as a journalist, the person they want to talk to. And you play a fabulously important role, much more important than doctors. I'm going to skip to the family I was going to talk about in more detail later, but in that family, Saranda, I mentioned her yesterday, Emma Daly knew the family as a journalist for the New York Times because they wanted to talk to journalists. And when it came to me visiting them as a family, only one of the 5, wanted to talk to me. 4 of them had already talked to Emma and told their story to the New York Times. It was much more important for them than talking to me. And the girl who was really sick did want to talk to me. Not only did she want to talk to me, she actually did an action replay of the whole massacre, which is why I knew about it all in detail. But when the War Crimes Tribunal came along and said, we want you for witnesses for Milosevic, can we talk to the children? I said, well, I don't know, ask them. So we sat down in a circle and they went around and said, can we talk to you? And every single child said, yes, I want to be talked to you. And they were all videotaped with their entire testimony. That was 1 year. Milosevic, as you know, died, no trial. 3 years later, they ring me up and say, we're all going to Belgrade. I say, why? They say, we're going to be in the trial of the one of the perpetrators, and we're all going on the witness stand. They all wanted to talk again. So it's context that matters. People want to talk to journalists and lawyers and policemen when they don't want to talk to therapists. So just saying don't force talking, be clear who and what you're going to talk about and what it's going to be used for. Okay, I'm going to skip on here. I'm not going to spend time on resilience because I've got time, but we can come back to it in discussion. There's another slide here, which is specifically on the don't force talking. What I do instead when I'm working clinically is I say, I know all about what happened. Your mum told me about the tsunami, so you don't have to tell me anything. I'm here to find out how you're feeling. I don't use that word. I say, how things are you for you now? I think John's quite right about feelings. Children, feelings, what's that funny word? How are things now? Any problems? And then if they go, I go concretely, can you sleep, whatever. And there's no harm in you doing this stuff either, because you might find out stuff that a doctor didn't know, like they're not sleeping at night and having nightmares. So do ask those questions if you want to be helpful. I also have some techniques I use clinically to open a discussion with difficult children. I'm not going to go into those. Will you come back to them in the discussion, because I'm skipping in order to come to the very important points I want to make. But I am going to give you And I really recommend it. This wonderful quote from Anna Freud, because, you know, the talking movement, as I call them, the kind of the trauma lobby who moved into trauma and humanitarian work in a big way in the 90s when I began this work, were all about going out there and getting children to ventilate because it would be good for them, psychological debriefing, which you now know does harm. And if only they'd read Freud, because she was saying a long time ago, speech does not serve as an outlet for the emotion to which it's attached. It is rather the other way around. Children will talk if and when they are ready. She said it. She was working with children in the Blitz in the Second World War, and it hasn't changed. Now I'm going to come on to something, excuse me skipping these slides. I can come back to them if you're interested. This is all clinical work. I want to come here because the other job I have coming out of my child psychiatry work is being sent to do basically anthropological work. I've spent my life interviewing children to understand their world. There's another book called Then They Started Shooting, which is about children in the Bosnian War, where I went to learn about their lives and I learned to do life history interviews. And then I was asked by my old agency to go back to Greece to talk to children, Syrian children in the migrant crisis, to do what they call a psychosocial assessment to see what their needs are. I use all the techniques that John has. I also get children into groups. Now, here was a fascinating thing. I came to the camp with my helpers and I said, so I'm here to learn about what children want and need and what their problems are and how we can make things better for them. Everybody wanted to talk to me, right? I had real difficulty limiting the group size. So first of all, children are dying, as John said. They're dying to tell you what's going on. But what do they want to tell you? They don't want to talk about the trauma story in Greece, in Syria. Forget that. They want to talk about the here and now and the details, the minutiae of the journey. I mean, like, you know, what was the size of the boat and how many people were on it and who didn't have a life jacket. They don't want to tell you trauma stories. They want to tell you about stuff they care about. Look at this one. I love this quote. First thing, change the toilets. The toilets were a nightmare. The NGOs, you come and you write our names and you lie to us. Don't ever come back because you're giving us false hope. A lot of organizations come and ask us what we need. In the end, they do nothing. So I'm fed up with their lying. Seems to me very important to get that message out. But then I thought, you know, it's all about me getting their story. Now, what I say here now, the rest of my talk may be a bit of a heresy, but I was asked by a publisher, same publisher who did the Bosnian book, to do a book called Migrant Child and do a kind of the same thing, go and learn about migrant children, put their stories out there, convey their world, all very good, and I'll become very famous as doing it, blah, blah, blah. And I listened to these children and I thought, that's not what it's about. I want them to tell their stories in any way they want, as they want, in any form, about what they want with their priorities. So instead of creating a book, I created a website. And I said to the children, you can tell any story you want, about anything you want, on this website. You just have to be a child on the move. That's the only limit, under 18. And for a start, we've got some free cameras. So, or you can paint. This is a boy from Guinea, amazing painter. Or you can take pictures, or you can make films. And the children have done everything. And I'm just going to give you 3 examples of what happens if you give children total freedom to do what they like. And the good thing was I could show, now it's kind of a rolling project. I show children the website and say, you can be on here. And they go, great, how can I do it? So here are the kids on a camp in Greece with their cameras. And what did they take pictures of? What did they want to talk about? Remember the lectures we have, all about connection and protection. This is so relevant to what is happening today. What children wanted to tell me about was who and what they loved. Every picture, and they took hundreds, and the film, masses of film. So then I got each child to choose their favorite picture that they wanted to exhibit. It was all about love. You can't read Arabic, but this is my mother's bed, the most important bed in the tent. She tidies it up. I never tidy mine. Teddy is my mum. Sometimes I could cuddle it at night. I feel safe when I cuddle it. How much is in that story? But then look at this one. They look nice like that. She got me her stuffed toys and she arranged them. She said, I've taken a picture of them. Because what I do, this is the storytelling aspect. I say, okay, you love this picture. We're going to show it to the world. Why? Simple as that. Just tell me in your own words, and I'm sitting there writing really fast, or with an Arabic translator, just please tell me why this picture is important. And please listen to this. They look nice like that. The bear is hugging the turtle and the dog. His head is resting on the turtle. They like each other. They're my friends. I talk to them. A foreign friend gave them to me. I had buckets of toys in Syria, not including the ones in the cupboard and on the bed. Barbie was my favorite. I miss her. When we were trying to leave our house, a bomb dropped. My grandfather's legs were broken, so he couldn't run with us, so he died. I couldn't go back for my toys, and we couldn't help him. My mother and father both started crying about my grandfather. I just bolted to the neighbors because their house was okay. Someone put a chip on our house. He stuck it on, and 10 minutes later the bomb dropped. How much is in that 5-minute story that I don't think I would ever get myself in an interview? Do you understand? When you give children, especially when you give them pictures, it's extraordinary what happens. I'm not going to show you more. I've managed to follow this up. When I followed them up, what were they photographing? Connection. This is Maria in the camp, and it's in the Netherlands last summer. She's photographed her father. This is a shelter in Athens, and I also use with younger children, and I didn't have any cameras in Athens. I said, draw what you like. So this girl said, okay, and she drew this extraordinarily beautiful, colourful picture. But do you know what the picture's of? It's the long grass in Turkey, and those are planes flying overhead, and they look like they're at a dance party. And again, I'm fascinated, John, I don't know if you find it, children are fascinated by journeys. I think because they always want to give you details of journeys. Please take the time to read these. Please take the time to look at the website, because you'll be overwhelmed with what children have to say. I'm going to finish. I'm in time. I want to finish here because I want Mr. Trump, I want everyone to read this story. So this boy, I want to tell you about this boy. So he's the kind of boy that will be brought to me. He's difficult. When we were doing the camera project, we had only 10 cameras, so we used to divide the kids up and we'd give the cameras out for 2 days at a time. He wanted to be in every group, and he'd come and sit there and he'd be like that. I couldn't move. I said, no, it's not your turn for the camera today. You can have it tomorrow. And it was just a pain. And he'd be ADHD in this country. In a minute, you'd have him on Ritalin. I don't do that. But anyway, definitely trouble. All right. And then at the end of the week, we get all the kids together with their best picture and their words, and we had a fabulous photographer in Greece working on making the pictures really good. Translation, we had PDFs, and we had a slideshow, and half the camp were there, and all the mums and dads, and all the children were sitting on the floor. And we read in Arabic and in English their words, and we showed the pictures. And we saved this till last. And when we read it out, after we read it out, everybody stood up and cheered, and the boy was crying, and he was like the most important boy in the camp for 10 minutes. It was just wonderful. I want to read you this. I can't read it on my slides, so I'm going to have to read from here. I love trees so much, but I couldn't get the full picture of this one. I like this tree the most, though. It's the most beautiful. It looks like a painting. It's pointy at the top, a perfect tree. And I also asked the tree permission to take a picture. We taught them all about consent. And she said yes. It reminds me of the greenery in Ladkia. There was a tree there that looks like this one, and I loved it too. So when I saw this, I loved it. It looks like one of those ancient trees. They've been through everything and have seen it all. They've seen refugees from all over the world. They witness our lives. Allah loves trees and created them to be good for us. Nature is good for us and cares for us. I feel safe when I'm around it, and trees never die until somebody harms them. That's why God punishes those who cut trees down. However long they live, the tree sees everything and never forgets. Every leaf on it protects you. So every time you pick a leaf, you'll be punished. Each leaf was born for a purpose and has a past and a story. For every leaf, every refugee it sees, a new leaf grows. It protects us from the sun. The Prophet Muhammad loved trees too. This tree is a source of strength in the camp. He's 9 years old. Our technique is to say, why do you like this picture? And we just kept writing. There was no prompt questions, nothing. We just kept writing till he stopped. It's just extraordinary. And I could analyze that story, but that is just the most extraordinary story about protection and love and nature. And this is what comes out. What's extraordinary to me is, when I did my Bosnian book, I got great stories, extraordinary stories of trek through the snow, across the mountains, and great trauma stories, and life stories, and child abuse stories. But I never got anything like this. What I suppose I'm saying is, if you have the space and the time and the means to give children the space to express themselves in any way they want, don't go in with an agenda. If you're working with these kind of children, you will come up with riches. You really will. Of course, it takes more time, and it may not be what your editor wants. But I recommend, this website is enormous. It's full of stories I wanted to share with you, and you will see, please. It's also an open resource. It's got, it's how to work it. It's there. So I hope you'll think about letting, it goes in keeping with what I said yesterday, not about interviewing children, but giving children the space to tell you themselves in their own voice, in their own words, what they want to tell you. That's what I'd like to end with. Thank you very much.
And the website is migrantstorytelling.org.
You can have this. Yeah, migrantchildstorytelling.org.
Yeah. And it's in the, it's tremendous. My guess is we're going to have a lot of questions, but I'm still going to take moderator's prerogative and ask one. I'm wondering if, I don't know, this might be different for John and for Lynne, but the issue of consent and how you make a difference between sort of what is the legal minimum for consent. You get a parent to say it's okay to talk to this child versus what is the moral standard for consent, if perhaps you have a sense that maybe talking to this child is not the best thing for them, and maybe the parent even has an agenda. It might be a very important agenda, might be a cause, might be something that he or she has good reason for wanting the child to help further. But what responsibility do you end up feeling like maybe this isn't the best thing for the child, even though I have every right to interview them?
Well, I think you sort of do that in two layers. I mean, I try to be really clear with the parents that it's going to be a difficult thing. Like, I want them to have every reason to say no. And I had a lot of people who did say no, who we talked for off and on for weeks or months, and then they just felt like their child was never ready. I mean, I even met some children for this series who I didn't end up interviewing and spent a lot of time with them, and then it just sort of never got to the point where they were ready. So I think first is you want to be really clear with the parents about what you're doing, and if you have other stories, really it's so useful if you can send other stories to people to say, this is the idea, this is what I'm trying to do. It makes it so much clearer to them. I think too, I had certainly situations with kids where I sat down for an interview and they did not want to talk, and we didn't talk. I mean, it was that simple. It's that it is. It's to Lynne's point, is that we should never, ever, ever force a kid to talk. It was really rare. I would say 90% of the kids I talked to, the first time I sat with them, they wanted to talk. Sometimes it took 2 or 3 times, and sometimes it never happened. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think, the idea the whole time is to let the parent and the child be in total control. You're not in control, they are, and you're just there to listen.
You want me to talk about consent? I can,
yes,
yeah.
if you have something.
I do, yes. You must have it. And clinically it's much easier because I'm not imposed usually on the clinical situation. It comes to me, so the consent is implicit in turning up. If the child is unaccompanied, I don't need parental consent. But if the child has parents, then there's nothing I can do without consent, although I can see the child alone and I can tell the child I'm talking in confidence. But if they reveal any kind of thing that's a protection issue, then I will have to take that wherever it's necessary to take. That's a whole clinical procedure, not so important for you. Journalistic stuff, I'm even stricter. On the website, you'll see my consent process. I use the UNICEF journalism guidelines, which are very good. But for instance, with the pictures, first of all, we taught the children to ask consent. He asked a tree, but to ask consent of those they're taking, and it's implicit if they're smiling. But then we went round and got the consent of the people in the pictures, because it's all going on the web. So there's pictures of little children. We got the consent of the child, and if it's an infant or someone under 16, we got the consent of the parent for the pictures. So I'm pretty strict, and I've got stricter. And so it's not enough for a child just to scribble and say it's okay.
I want to quickly add something that I didn't include in my sort of tip sheet that Lynne brought up that is just essential, is if the kid has written anything and they're willing to let you see it, do that. What they'll say in the written word like that can be just so incredibly powerful. And a lot of kids write. I mean,
So this is talking.
Right.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
right.
right.
But if you can, if they have journals or things like that. I mean, in the hotel right now, this little girl I was referencing who won't ever sort of talk about her traumatic event, she journals every single day, and gave me permission to read all of her journals. So I have something like hundreds of pages of her writing right now that I have to read. So,
Right.
Well, I have two questions. One is related to the topic that you were talking, because I don't know if the law, it's a question, the law varies from country to country to have access to the consent of the children. In some countries, for example, in Brazil, when you're interviewing street children, you don't even have access to the parents, or what would you do in this situation if you have to report about street children, for example, and you don't have access to anyone, like to give you the consent to do the report,
Right.
for example. And the other question is, I think it's it's amazing the technique of creating the situation where children tell their stories. But my question is if it works perhaps very good for documentaries, but if you think if it would work for other kinds of reports, for example, if you have to write news, if you are covering war, if you have, you see children, you see the situation, and the children occupied the headlines very easily, and you want to interview them, but it's a different situation, then create this perfect environment to interview them. If you could comment on it.
Sure. Well, some of these environments for me were not perfect. I went to Chicago, which is a part of Chicago that was very, very dangerous, and followed a 16-year-old, but he'd been shot when he was 15. And so, I think to the first point, I think if I was in that situation and I didn't have, if I was in a war zone and maybe a child was telling me something that was like critically important, a story I needed to tell, I wouldn't use their name. So I would never use a child's name under any circumstances if I didn't have permission from their parent or guardian. And even sometimes we think about not using names if something is just that incredibly sensitive anyway. Even if the parent says, no, I want you to use their name, we still have a conversation about every story about a child to say, should we show this person's face and should we use their name, to the point that was brought up earlier about, when this 20 years from now, because of the internet, right? Like, what are we going to have out there about this person forever?
I anonymize all children, whether I say I'm not going to use your real name, especially on something like this. Regarding, as I already said, if a child is unaccompanied, which a street child is, then you have to take the consent you've got. But that would make me wary of interviewing children under 10 because of the cognitive level of understanding of the implications of what they're doing. So you have to think that through very carefully if you're going to have unaccompanied 10-year-old children tell you, maybe about gangsters who are attacking them and they're making themselves vulnerable, and you don't understand fully yourself anyway. So there are all sorts of implications there. I get more and more cautious, and anonymization is really important, I think. So that's my view.
I think you can always be really clear with your reader too. I would just say, like, if you're in that situation, just say really just plainly what the situation was, that this was a child on the street who had no parent you didn't have access to, so that's why we're not naming this person.
So thank you guys so much. This is like incredibly helpful, so we really appreciate all your tips. John, I'm curious, there's obviously, I think with anyone that all of us interview, there's sometimes you feel a responsibility to do this person right. But we're also journalists, right? And especially if you're being given this sort of intimate access to people's lives. And so I'm wondering, in the course of these projects, if you've had times where you wrestled over including something or not including something because it might maybe hurt the parent or hurt the child, or that it's really important for someone to maybe know a piece of information, but it might not be the best thing for that person. So I'm just curious if you've had those situations, and if so, what you've decided. And I don't know if you have like an example of one time deciding to leave something out and one time to put something in. But if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that is such a good question. I don't think there was any story that I didn't wrestle with that. So one thing I did with all of these pieces is I took the parents through the stories really, really carefully. And I don't normally do that, but I felt like these people were giving me such extraordinary access and were trusting me in such a profound way that I owed them transparency. So I took them through these pieces, and if they had an objection, then I would, the way I would frame it is that, look, this is to check the facts. I want to make sure that I'm getting everything right. And I wasn't reading them word for word, but I would essentially take them through every detail that I was going to use in the story. And I never had an objection, but if someone had said, that's too much, I don't want people to know that about my kid, then I would have had a conversation with them, and I would have had a conversation with my editor. Frankly, I'm shocked that no one ever said, there is an example though in my career that I can use, that I was on Deadline back in Florida on a story that we'd heard on the police scanner that there was a drowning, or that a child had fallen into a pool. So the photographer and I ran out to this home, and I just witnessed the scene where this mother had just gotten there about the time that I did, and she was outside and pacing, and they wouldn't let her in the home, and the father was in the home, and I knew the police officers well, and they told me that the kid hadn't made it, but they had not told the parents yet. So I know that before they did, and then they bring the mother in, and there's this screaming from inside the house, and then these two people just sort of burst. The father bursts out of the home and collapses on the sidewalk, and this is all happening, in front of us. And I had maybe an hour to write that story. I went back and wrote the story really quickly, and there was a detail in the piece that one of the siblings had left the door open, the sliding door open, and that's how the child had gotten out and drowned. And we took that out. And I was a really young reporter, and I was shell-shocked from what I had seen. So I just sort of wrote it the way I saw it. But I had a really good editor who said, we're going to leave that out, because someday that kid's going to get older, and we're not going to indict, a 5-year-old for killing their 2-year-old sibling. So that was, I think, an example that's always stuck in my mind.
I'd like to just add an example that I encountered once. I was interviewing teenagers with severe mental illness, like bipolar disorder, and this one 16-year-old girl, she and her mother were both very open about she'd been arrested for prostitution, for drug use, for assault on a police officer, all this crazy stuff. And I got a call from the mother maybe a week or so after the interview, and she said, there's something I want you to leave out. And that was, they told us, they had told me that she also had an abortion. And that was the only thing that she cared about, making sure that did not go in the story. And she was fine with all of the other information. I just thought that was really interesting, that you don't know what a family is going to consider to be out of bounds and what they're not going to consider out of bounds.
It's often what you don't expect, too.
Yeah,
it's often
yeah.
some sort of minute
Yeah,
detail
I can understand that
That,
particular
right,
issue,
right.
but I still thought, but you were okay with the arrest and the assault and all the rest, but go figure.
I would like to ask John about cameras,
Mhm.
as I work for television.
Yeah.
How do you build this confidence with the camera inside the room, or you prefer to build the confidence and then call the photographer? How do you deal with it with the camera?
So
And I also like to add something. That photography, the boy laying down, I don't know if it was a moment, a natural moment,
Yeah.
or if it was directed by the photographer somehow.
Yeah, no, it was totally natural. So the only photography that we do that's sort of staged are portraits, where the reader will know. But when he's laying there, it's that he was just spending time with him, and the boy just laid down in his father's bedroom. And Ricky Cariotti was the photographer with me on most of these stories. To the first point, so I always go first, always. It's just me in a notebook, often for several days. And then I then, once sort of everybody's comfortable with me and warmed up to me, then I bring in the photographer. So I think it's overwhelming enough to have a stranger in this moment of trauma, right, or this really awful moment in somebody's life. So I always ease in first and get them used to me, and sort of prepare them for the camera too. I say, is it okay in a day or two if photographer comes and just spends time with you, And I think it's really important too that it's the right, I'm really particular about which photographers I work with, because some are sort of better in these situations than others. And I think I don't have children, but I actually prefer to work with photographers who do, because I just think it's just easier. I think it can connect a little bit more. In this series, I worked with totally 3 different photographers, mostly one, but they were all photographers who could just sort of disappear in a room. They weren't going to talk a lot, they weren't going to engage a lot, they weren't going to, they were going to be warm and friendly, but try to be as sort of fly on the wall as they could be.
Do you think that it's always necessary to talk to the child? Because I write a lot of sexual abuse stories. I usually talk to the mother or the lawyer. I get all the details, but I don't want to talk to the child because I don't want her or him to live through the same thing again. Is it right, or what do you think as a journalist?
Well, I think Lynne's point was really good on this, was that often you can get the circumstances of the event from other people, you know, and often I would do that. Not with all of these children did I even ask them about what they witnessed or what they went through, because I knew. But I think for me, it's always important to get their voice in another way, to fill them out as fully formed figures in your story. For me, it was always frustrating to read stories about children in which the children were very one-dimensional. They were like stick figures. They were the victim of whatever, but they didn't, beyond their name or maybe their age, you didn't know anything about them. And so even in that circumstance, I think it's worth spending time with them just to understand who they are, you know, and often too, you can see the effects of what they've gone through without having to ask them anything. It gets to that idea of just sort of spending time in their worlds, that you'll see the effects, maybe, you know, that you'll just see it come up without ever having to ask them anything.
John, I read your story quite some time ago, especially the little girl. There was a little girl that was also the little boy that you took the photo with the Paw Patrol stuff. There was another little girl who had been so profoundly affected that she wasn't able. I just remember it just affected me so much, that story. So thank you so much.
Sure.
But my question actually is for Lynne. And in 90 seconds, could you tell me why you don't want to why you don't like the word trauma?
Because the word is misleading and confusing and is used in so many ways. It doesn't communicate anything. So trauma can mean, first of all, it comes from, I can't remember the derivation. Never mind, I can't in 90 seconds. But it's used by the physical people who deal with physical trauma, and it's used by psychological people. So whether we're talking about physical or psychological trauma. Secondly, it's used for both event and reaction. So people talk about the trauma, meaning the abuse, or they talk about the trauma, meaning the experience that the person is having, and they're not clear. It's not clear. Often in poor journalism, which none of you do, it's absolutely unclear. First of all, are we talking about physical or psychological, or are we talking about event or reaction? That's a four-way grid for a start. And then we get to the question of pathology. And thanks to the media, none of you in this room, mostly now, people now think of the word trauma, its association is with psychological, psychopathological reaction. So when I talk to journalists especially, we don't mean that. We recognize that many people who experience trauma, i.e. they're talking about events, aren't in any way made sick, and they understand. I didn't do my bit on resilience, but they understand that most people are resilient. But the word is enormously confusing. As a consequence, in the IASC guidelines for mental health and psychosocial support in emergency settings, written in 2007, freely downloadable in multiple languages on the WHO website or IASC, I really recommend them. We say, please don't use the word, we say, use the word trauma as an adjective, traumatic reaction, traumatic event, then it's clear, is it reaction or event? And be clear as to whether you're talking about pathology or not. And actually, you could do the world a big service by doing that, because the assumption, you go to a disaster everywhere. Everyone is traumatized, another word I hate, and that means they've all got PTSD, which isn't true, and they're all going to be sick for the rest of their lives and turn into little terrorists or whatever.
All right.
Thank you. Thank you, John and Lynne, for giving quite beneficial tips. My question is, I work for electronic media, and John, you work for print media, and Lynne also gave examples of printing. I mean, I think it's easier to file a story for print media or on the website while interviewing the children. But I work for radio. For radio, we need impacts, and the impact is voice. And for video, we need sound bites. How can we interview the children, I mean, to get information from him while he talks, I mean, fluently somehow, or he gives some information in one row in this case? This was my question, I mean, for the electronic media.
It can be hard to it's easier, certainly for me, no question, to be able to just show up with a notepad. And but there's been some I met a woman a couple of weeks ago at another conference who went inside a school. She was a radio reporter and went inside a school over the course of a whole year, and just would turn the audio on, and just listen. And that I think speaks to the idea of not just going in to sit down and have a conversation and ask a bunch of questions. Of it takes the time, right? So we don't all have that, but if you do, that's sometimes the only way, is to just literally spend time in their space and turn on your recorder and wait for those moments, or wait for a moment when you can ask that question. That is, I think, probably easier for radio than it is for video. Honestly, the video part is sort of beyond my expertise, honestly, but I just know that I've never had a circumstance when I spent enough time with a child in these circumstances that it eventually there wasn't a really clear moment where something happened in front of me, or they said something in front of me that kind of told me everything I needed.
I am actually a radio
Yes.
reporter, and that's exactly what I do. But I think one thing that's interesting is that you can just have it on and have sounds of the kids, not necessarily talking about this event, but just leading their lives or playing, and people will get the sense of who this kid is. And then in the narration, you say what happened because you've already interviewed or you've already had it through other means. So the listener will actually feel like they've heard from the kid about this, but really they've just heard the kid and they've just gotten a little sense of this is a real kid that this has happened to, but you don't actually need to get them to, describe what happened to them in actual words.
The children made film, and that short film, we edited it because we had so much film. But that short film, it's on the website, tells you more about living in a refugee camp in northern Greece than any television journalism I've said. The kids interviewed each other. What do you like about the camp? Food is terrible. Fix the toilet. It was brilliant. It's really, and are there bears? And they're going out in the woods in the dark looking for bears. It's amazing. I mean, video and radio can be very powerful.
Anna.
Thank you so much. This has been just the best panel. So I was curious, John, if you, after you've done your pre-reporting with the parents, do you try to be selective about when you talk to the kids? I mean, you talked to Tyshawn right before his dad's wake or whatever it was. So do you try to seek out like potentially more impactful events? And also, do you think it's better to talk to them before and after specific times like that, or is it better just go on an average afternoon? And
so I think if you can be there for those events, you want to be. But for me, in those settings, I kind of do two things. So I'm either reconstructing or I'm immersing. And with Tyshawn, that story was basically all immersion, where I just was literally just existing in his space. I mean, I knew I was going to spend the whole funeral day with him, and I knew I was going to spend the whole day before when he went back to school on that Monday. So I just got there really early and wasn't asking him any questions that day. It was just hanging out, And so at one point when he's putting on his clothes that he's had laid out for 3 days for his father's funeral, he's putting this stuff on, and he looks up at me and says, whoever invented guns needs to stop. Just says this, like, unprompted. I wasn't asking him questions. He just said that because that's what was on his mind. So, the Townville story in South Carolina about these little kids, that was 8 months after the event. There was nothing happening then. I didn't have anything to see. There wasn't really a moment to see. And so it was just a lot of sort of average afternoons. So I think the story will sort of dictate often. But if you can see a powerful moment like that, you definitely want to. You just don't want to be doing sort of your interviewing at that time. You just want to observe, I think.
We have time for a couple more questions. Where's the thingy?
You said you do not talk to kids under 10?
No.
No?
I said I wouldn't talk to, I would have difficulty. She was asking about unaccompanied street children. I talk to small children all the time, clinically, and but I think she was asking specifically about what do you do about consent, and I think it raises very difficult questions, especially with street children and children living with communal violence, to interview an under 10-year-old and just take their consent, because I don't, especially going into a culture not my own, I don't know the risks I'm exposing that child to. That's my concern, and it was for that very specific context. I talk to small children all the time.
All right, should we have?
John, you mentioned that, thank you so much, the panel has been fascinating, but you mentioned that you had to leave out some stories of children that you spent some time with because of whatever reason.
Right.
I would like you to tell me a little bit more about that, because, I mean, especially doing kind of research, you do spend a lot of time with some, and like, how do you deal with kind of then leaving them out, you know, after?
Right. Well, I mean, it's frustrating to invest a lot of time and then stories to not work out. But I think, you know, when you're doing really, really ambitious work, I think you sort of understand going into it that a lot of it's not going to work out. You know, one of the stories I was thinking about is a little boy whose mother was murdered in front of him, and by a sort of a ex-boyfriend. And the father, who had not been involved in his life, started to take care of him. So I hung out with him some. You know, his father sort of had a little restaurant and a barber shop, and so I would hang out. And we just kept talking and talking and talking, and eventually the father just said, I'm not going to get there. You know, I'm not going to be comfortable enough for you to talk to my son. And I knew going into that maybe the chances of it working out were like 25%. I knew that going in, but you know, still worth a few of my Saturdays to just go spend that time and see if it did work out.
Yeah, I guess my question was more about kind of responsibility towards them who've already given you maybe a part of a story.
Right.
Like,
yeah, so, I mean, that was, I don't think I had a situation where I sort of told someone or they gave me consent and said, yes, come tell our story, and then I didn't. Certainly in my career, I've had to do that. Well, that's not true. I did have one case. That's true. Yeah, I had one this year. I had one that year, that a woman who I had intended to tell her son's story and didn't. And she was really upset. I mean, she was really, really upset about it. And you know, I just had to be honest. You know, what happened there was Las Vegas. You know, I was going to tell her story, and then Las Vegas happened, and I got on a plane, and that was 2 months out of my life just gone. And I tried to be as honest as I could, but she still... You know, I ended up sort of writing her a letter apologizing that it didn't work out, and have a good relationship with her now. But I think you just want to be honest with people. Just say, here's why it didn't work out, and I'm sorry. You know, that's hard, though. That is a really unpleasant thing to do.
So there was.
Thank you for all the tips that you've given to us. That's really useful. I have one more question. Is how do you get access to the families? And my second question would be, how did you choose these individual stories among all the other stories?
So, you know, this series, we wanted to kind of keep turning the lens and showing gun violence in different forms and how it impacted children in different ways. You know, some stories were really clear, like the Las Vegas story. Basically, as soon as that shooting happened, it was on a Sunday night in the U.S., and we were just looking to see if children were there, looking for news stories, if anybody mentioned anything. And we came across something from this school that they had said they had these twin cheerleaders who were seniors at the school had both been shot. And then one of their friends tweeted their name, and then I found the mom on Facebook and sent her a message, said, would you mind, this is what I do, and here's one of the stories I've done, would you mind if I came? And she said, sure. So I got on a plane, like totally blind on what I was going to get or walk into or the access or any of that. So, you know, with Tyshawn, the first child, I had been trying to get his mother and his grandmother, and no one would get back to me. I couldn't get anybody to call me back or respond to text. So I just showed up to the vigil, like a Saturday evening, and it was like 10 degrees in DC, and I just stood there for 2 hours until I got a chance to talk to the mom. And when she saw me, I guess this is a tip too, always show up. If you have the option to show up rather than make a phone call, always go, always go, always show up. Because, you know, it's so much harder to slam a door in someone's face than it is to hang up.
And you're showing some respect also.
Exactly. You're showing that you're serious. You're showing that, like, they saw me at that vigil for 2 hours standing there just to get to talk to them. And I think that's why they said yes. And then after that, you know, once you're in, usually, then you get as much access as you want. So.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you, Karen, for being such a graceful chair. in the face of a wires-crossed introduction. I want to now take the sort of the chair's privilege in a desperate attempt to recover my own dignity, but also to ask one final question for the day of all three of you. Interviewing children is also arduous work when it's on such difficult terrain of violence and loss and aftermath. In the 90 seconds or less mode that Lynne pioneered so effectively, what do you each do to take care of yourselves? What are a few things that you do to take care of yourselves while doing this kind of stuff?
Say.
Yeah. Really
I'm going to do whatever
bad.
you say.
Sleep well. Really, I'm not big in the self-care movement. Not because I neglect it, but because I think the basics of sleeping, eating, leading a stable life are really important. I don't think that there's anything very special that you have to do. You have to love the work. And, obviously, I come from a different context, but I've chosen to immerse my life in humanitarian situations. I don't mean that makes me in any way blasé, but it means that I'm familiar with the stresses. I'm not jumping on planes and going into just hearing the stories. I'm living and organizing in that context. I've got friends around me. Having friends around you is really important. And really caring about what you're doing. If you're just doing it, if it's just a job, don't do it. I really care about the children I'm engaged with, so that really matters. And if talking with them or giving them a space to have a voice or telling their stories helps them in any way, then that's my reward, and I feel better for doing it. And I'm one of those people that needs to be up against it. I'm much more unhappy not being able to talk to children on the southern border at the moment than I am. That's more. I feel more anxious and agitated and upset when I can't do something. And what I can do is talk to children. That's my skill. I've done it all my life. So I feel happy doing it, which isn't a very satisfactory answer.
It's a completely satisfactory answer.
I've struggled with that, really, of knowing what to do. I try to get away. I haven't done that in a long time because I'm.
Take breaks.
Yeah, which I just haven't done that in a very long time.
You come to conferences on trauma.
Right, yeah. This is my break.
For relaxation.
I think you shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. I think that's so important, is to have people you trust who you can talk about it, and reach out to the Dart Center. That's one of the wonderful things about this place, is that they give resources to those of us who are dealing with these things. And there will be a point, certainly, when I do talk to somebody professionally, someone like Lynne, maybe, because I had an episode, being totally transparent, a little bit after the Parkland, Florida shooting. I was at the time working on a story about a school shooter and was very much immersed in this person's really dark thinking and his plan to kill hundreds of children. And then I look up and, the Parkland shooting is on CNN right over my desk. And, I just had a little bit of I don't know what I would call it. I got sort of nauseated by that, and I didn't go to that. And that was purposeful. I just didn't think in that moment that I was in the right sort of headspace to do that. So I think one thing is sort of, know when to not go to, and to not do it, and know sort of like at this moment you're at your limit.
Do take, the number one is please take breaks.
Yeah.
Take breaks.
And I use a lot of distraction techniques, and this, I don't actually know if this is a healthy response or not, but I'm very different in my role as a journalist than I am in my role as a person. I'm actually a very anxious mother. I've been talking to people all weekend about my son having a dangerous job out in the mountains, and I'm just I'm constantly worrying. But when I go into the role of journalist, I just sort of have I try to be empathetic, of course, but kind of you're just in a different place, and you're just, having a bit of a emotional wall in doing the stories. That helps, and also Ativan.
also.
One thing Lynn said that I can totally relate with is on that day when Parkland happened, the minute that I had a story to do, I was fine. Like literally in the second that I was going to write something,
Yeah.
I felt better, which I don't know if that's healthy or not, but
That
yeah.
work is protective.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you all again. This was a profound panel.